I was recently just looking at the PragerU YouTube channel, just looking for videos that I could respond to because, that's always fun. And I came across this gem of a video called Capitalism Wins, and it came out a while ago, back I think in February. I don't really know how this video went under my radar because I'm usually very good at responding to stuff like this, but of course, because it's a PragerU video, like most other videos, it is complete dog shit, so we're gonna respond to it. Why, you may ask? Because I am a total masochist. But before I respond to the video, I kind of want to give you just a little detailed description of the system that I support. So I consider myself to be a socialist in the sense that I support the democratization of the means of production. But what does this look like in reality? So one way we can do this is through things like worker cooperatives. Worker cooperatives are basically just businesses that are collectively owned and democratically controlled by their employees. And there are various different policies that we could implement that would encourage the growth of cooperatives. One of these being giving the workers the right of first refusal. Basically what that means is that when a company goes bankrupt and it goes on the market, the workers are the ones who have the first opportunity to buy out that company. Another thing that we can push for are things known as wage earner funds. And wage earner funds are basically policies in which the government will tax a proportion of a company's profits, and they will put that money within a special fund that is controlled by the union. And these special funds are basically charged over time to buy up stocks within the given companies. So what this basically does is it slowly over time transitions these companies from private ownership to collective employee ownership. Now, the most prominent example of the wage earner fund, or at least the one that most people seem to talk about, is known as the Swedish Meidner plan. And if anyone would like to learn about the Meidner plan, I will leave a link down in the description, of course. The next program that I support is what many people might refer to as a social or citizens' wealth fund. Social wealth funds are basically just public investment funds that the government uses to buy up assets within the economy. Predominantly, they're used to buy up stocks within various competing companies, and sort of slowly over time, this transitions a large section of the economy under public ownership. The profits generated by these assets would of course go back into the fund, and then we, the people, could indirectly control the fund through our democratic government. We could use the fund to fund very important things like welfare and social programs, public transportation, public infrastructure, public education. Maybe you would want to use it to fund a UBI sort of system that pays everyone dividends. So this fund would essentially belong to the people. It's the people's wealth, and it gives everyone a stake in the economy. Now you might ask, would this system actually work? And surprisingly enough, we do have some real-life working examples. The most prominent of these is the Government Pension Fund of Norway, also known as the Oil Fund. If you'd like to know more about the Government Pension Fund of Norway, I will leave a link down in the description to a website called the People's Policy Project. The article just talks about Norway's state-owned companies and how they've been doing throughout the pandemic. If you would like to know more about social wealth funds in general, I will leave a couple links down in the description. The first one is by a person named Matt Brunig. The article is really just a brief overview of how a system like this would work within the United States. The second article is from Jacobin, and it talks about how a social wealth fund within the United States would massively reduce wealth inequality while at the same time democratizing the economy. So with all that being said, let's actually get on with the video.
There are many in the West, including many who should know better, who find it difficult, unpopular, or just plain embarrassing to defend capitalism.
This really should not be surprising whatsoever. Capitalism has many problems. For one, capitalism is fundamentally undemocratic. The average American works around 90,000 hours, or a third of their entire lifetime, working in companies with no democratic mandate to the mass of their employees. Capitalist enterprises are essentially just mini dictatorships. Capitalism within the United States has also been creating more and more wealth inequality, while at the same time decreasing economic mobility, making it harder for people to escape poverty. Which helps us understand why the United States, despite being the wealthiest country on Earth, has some of the highest rates of relative child poverty compared to the rest of the developed world. It's also important to understand that capitalism fails to internalize externalities, which oftentimes leads to things like, pollution, which is currently destroying the planet.
I take the opposite view. We should double down on it, for a very simple reason. It remains not just the best, but the only chance for the least fortunate in the world to make life better for themselves and their children.
You can say this if you want, but the data still speaks for itself. Economic mobility within the United States has been decreasing for a very long time now. And according to a study by Our World in Data, historical poverty reductions haven't been because of laissez-faire capitalism, but primarily massive amounts of social spending. And according to a meta-analysis titled The Welfare State and Anti-Poverty Policy Within Rich Countries, they find that there is a strong empirical relationship at country level between the overall level of social spending and various measures of inequality and inequality reduction, including relative poverty. The meta-analysis essentially found that high levels of social spending in OECD-rich countries have been shown to reduce relative poverty. Now, additionally, there was no advanced economy that was able to achieve low levels of relative poverty with low levels of social spending. So this idea that capitalism is solely responsible for bringing people out of poverty and providing people with great economic mobility is just not the case. Now, of course, capitalism does play a role in this, but not even Marxists would disagree with that. But from the majority of literature on the subject, it seems to be the case that the most effective way of reducing poverty is through massive amounts of social spending.
And the more we see of capitalism's rival, socialism, the more proof we have that capitalism is the way we want to go. I've seen this over and over again, from my own childhood to my time as governor of South Carolina to most recently and most dramatically during my tenure as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. I grew up in South Carolina as the daughter of Indian immigrants. My mom started a small shop selling clothes and gifts that grew into a successful business. She showed my brothers, my sister, and me what it meant to live the American dream. As my mother's story so vividly illustrates, America is a country where people can find jobs that match their talents and passions. Some Americans take this for granted.
So I'm very sorry for what I'm about to say, but I don't care. I do not care about your personal anecdote. It is not data. But aside from this not being data, your anecdote isn't even applicable to the majority of Americans. At the end of the day, the majority of Americans are never going to open up a single business. Most of them are going to be workers. Now, don't get me wrong. It's cool that your mother opened up a shop and that your family got to live the American dream, but statistically speaking, the majority of the people within this country will never get to experience what you had.
The rest of the world envies it.
This just isn't true. There are plenty of wealthy, industrialized nations out there in which their average workers have better lives than the workers here in the United States. For example, Germany, which is known to be the strongest economy in Europe, their average worker works around 400 hours less than the average American worker. For anyone who's bad at math, that's 10 full work weeks.
As governor of South Carolina, I marveled at capitalism's power to improve lives. Our pro-free market policies helped bring in more than $20 billion in investment and created jobs in every county of the state. Those jobs provide dignity and purpose. And as I often say, when you give a person a job, you take care of a family.
So Nikki Haley's basic argument here is, hey, capitalism is great, look at the effects of my free market economic policies that I implemented while I was in public office. Well, okay then, how about we actually go over Nikki Haley's real economic record according to the AFL-CIO. Now, Nikki Haley seemed to talk quite a bit about, jobs and unemployment, so how about we look at Nikki Haley's economic record on unemployment? Despite Haley's 5 years of lavish economic development deals, South Carolina has one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. The state ranks 45th among U.S. states for unemployment as of July 2015, at which time its unemployment rate was 6.4%. Incremental improvements in the rate of unemployment in South Carolina are likely attributable to general economic recovery and were on par with improvements seen around the country. Now let's move to income. While nominal median household income in the U.S. has recovered to its pre-Great Recession levels, South Carolina's median household income still trails its 2007 level. This suggests that Haley's efforts to reward companies with taxpayer dollars isn't trickling down to South Carolina's working families. And there are a myriad of other problems that I can look at, like the fact that she perpetuated income disparities between white people and black people, her controversial economic development deals, massive plant closures and layoffs, attacks on funding for public education, dismal healthcare rankings, and an opposition to Medicaid expansion. Wow, Nikki Haley, you are truly a chariot of aggression fighting for working class people. Indeed.
During my time as the U.S. ambassador to the UN, I was reminded that not every country enjoys the same freedom and prosperity as America. More than 1.5 billion people still suffer under socialist regimes.
Now, I think that this infographic is really interesting because it really shows how the conservative narrative on socialism changes over time. For example, there are two countries on this infographic, China and Vietnam, which are countries that are ostensibly pretty capitalist, And I think that's funny because anytime China or Vietnam have some sort of like economic boon, conservatives will always be quick to point out like, oh, look at those capitalist nations, look what capitalism did it. They're doing so well now. But then when those countries start to do something bad, maybe they do some sort of like authoritarian action, those same conservatives will then turn and say, oh, look what socialism did. Look at this communist regime. It's very interesting how the narrative is always changing, even if that narrative contradicts a prior narrative. I also think it's really funny that they have Venezuela on this infographic, considering the fact that Venezuela is in no way a socialist country because the majority of the means of production within Venezuela are indeed privately owned. Very sorry, PragerU, but socialism does have a definition. You might want to use it sometime.
In 2018, I stood on the Simon Boulevard Bridge at the border of Venezuela and Colombia. I watched thousands of Venezuelans cross into Colombia for the only meal they might have that day. I held a beautiful baby girl. Her mother told me all she wanted for her daughter was a future of freedom. They were one of millions of Venezuelan families whose lives have been destroyed by the country's socialist policies.
So while I do not believe that Venezuela is a socialist country, I am not going to deny the fact that they are a country that did implement some left-leaning economic policies and that they did call themselves socialist, and that the country has been going through an economic collapse in recent years. I'm not going to deny any of that. However, it's still important to understand why Venezuela collapsed. So for anyone that doesn't know, at one point in time, Venezuela's economy was heavily dependent on oil. They hadn't actually properly diversified their interests. So when the oil markets ended up crashing and the price of oil plummeted, their economy shrank as a result, and they weren't able to pay off their national debts. So the government resorted to massive amounts of money printing, which caused the hyperinflation that we know today. And it also doesn't help when you take in the fact that America also ended up placing sanctions on Venezuela. So was Venezuela's economic collapse a result of bad government policy? Yes it was, but I don't see how this in any way implicates socialism, especially since Venezuela is not a socialist country.
So imagine my dismay to find that socialism has become trendy here in America. American socialists claim they seek a more enlightened socialism, like those found in Scandinavian countries. But those countries are not socialist. They're capitalist and offer large welfare benefits.
So, are the Scandinavian countries socialist? No, they are not. They are capitalist countries with large welfare states, indeed. However, I think that this totally misses the point of why so many people on the left look up to these countries. We acknowledge that these countries are indeed just capitalist countries with massive welfare states, but the reason we like them isn't because they're socialist, but because of the certain economic policies that they've implemented that could potentially be used to move gradually towards socialism. For example, Norway's massive state ownership through their social wealth fund program.
But ironically, to make their system work, they've had to repeatedly slash their corporate tax rates. Denmark has cut its corporate rate by more than half since the 1990s.
Now, this is just incorrect. When looking at OECD data, going all the way back to 1985, on taxes for corporate profits within the Scandinavian countries, we can see that corporate taxes have remained largely the same. The only exception here is the country of Norway, which has seen some decline with their corporate tax rate over the years, but nonetheless still has a very, very, very high corporate tax rate.
Other democracies, including Israel, India, and the UK, experimented with socialism, only to abandon it. And only then did they thrive.
So I just want to say that I think it's really funny that PragerU used these three countries as examples to show that capitalism is amazing, and only when they adopted capitalism did they finally thrive. I think it's funny that they do that despite the fact not showing any sort of data or any sort of evidence whatsoever. I could easily just throw this out and say, oh, I'm going to move on because they didn't provide any evidence, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to challenge this and I'm going to attempt to find out just what they were talking about. So what I think Nikki Haley is referring to with India is a system of very harsh regulations within India called License Raj that was operated from like the late 1940s all the way to 1990. It was the system in which basically if you wanted to like operate a company or any sort of business whatsoever, you'd have to go through like 80 different like government agencies, and you'd have to satisfy every single one of them before you could even operate an enterprise whatsoever. But to be honest, I don't really see what implicates socialism as a concept here. It really just seemed to be a set of really shitty bureaucratic economic policies, and that's pretty much it. Now, Israel was never a socialist country. However, they did have the kibbutzim, which was a pretty socialistic model, but the kibbutzim never actually became the dominant force of social, political, and economic life. What Nikki Haley is most likely referring to here is an economic crisis that happened within Israel in which Israel experienced hyperinflation that was due to mass money printing, similar to Venezuela. So once again, this has nothing to do with socialism in terms of, collective ownership over the means of production. So from what I understand about the situation in Great Britain, apparently at one point in time, the Labour Party was in power and they were passing a bunch of left-leaning economic policies. And apparently the British government also had a lot of state-owned companies, predominantly in things like petroleum and British gas, manufacturing and steel. They owned British Airways, bus lines and railways, among many other things. But by no means was the United Kingdom a socialist country in which private ownership over industry had been abolished. And from what I understand, this British model worked quite well. But apparently what happened was, in the 1970s, there was this very general global economic collapse that basically affected every country, including the UK, and apparently the Tories within the UK used this as political cannon fodder to move away from the model that was being advocated by the British Labour Party. This eventually led to the Conservative takeover by people like Margaret Thatcher, and we all know how that turned out.
The results are in. Socialism, however you want to define it, has failed everywhere it's been tried. A handful of elites sitting in a government office can never outthink millions of business owners and consumers making millions of individual choices every moment of every day.
So this to me seems to be a critique of centrally planned economies, what many people might refer to as the economic calculation problem. And I, because I am not a fan of centrally planned economies, I get to skip this one. I get to move on. This criticism doesn't apply to me. Score!
You'd think we'd have gotten the message by now. An entire generation of American adults are too young to remember the suffering socialism caused during the last century. Instead of teaching students to reject our country's history and founding ideals, schools should have a required class on the history and collapse of the Soviet Union.
So regarding these supposed schools that teach kids to reject American values, I have no clue what the fuck she's talking about. Now that'd be cool if these schools really exist. I'd like to see those. Now regarding kids being taught a class on the history and collapse of the Soviet Union, I don't see a need for this. Most kids in the United States are already taught this information. Most people in the US already know what an autocratic nightmare the Soviet Union was.
Young people at least have the excuse of being miseducated. But what does one say about corporate CEOs who give in to social trends rather than standing up for a system that their own businesses and workers depend on? I'm talking about advocates of so-called stakeholder capitalism, a philosophy that retains the word capitalism but abandons its meaning. Recently, the chief executives of some of America's largest companies changed their self-definition. They said companies should focus on customers, workers, and communities. This is just politically correct nonsense. These CEOs know that's what successful businesses already do. It's what they have to do to survive in our capitalist system. A company that cheats its customers, mistreats its workers, and abuses its community won't be around long.
So I think what Nikki here is having problems with is the idea that capitalism fails to internalize externalities. So I'm pretty sure all of us here can agree that capitalists are very interested in maximizing profits, and the equation to calculate profits is revenue minus costs. So let's keep in mind here that when a capitalist does something, not all of the negative effects of that action that affect society, those don't necessarily always translate towards negative negative effects in a capitalist's profits or revenue. So capitalists will oftentimes cut corners and in the process cutting costs so that they can maximize profits even if it hurts society. Examples of this would be things like pollution. To give you a more specific example of this, I'm going to tell you what Coca-Cola has been doing in India. So Coca-Cola has been setting up shop in India near sources of fresh water, and they have been using this fresh water in the production of Coca-Cola products. And if you don't know, it takes around 3 liters of fresh water to make 1 liter of Coca-Cola. And in the process of this, there's obviously a lot of waste that's involved, and that waste is then pumped back into these streams and rivers, which are now affecting Indian communities. Overall, Nikki Haley's perspective is really lacking a lot of nuance here. She probably doesn't even realize that capitalists are incentivized to keep wages as low as possible as a way of cutting labor costs. Nikki here also doesn't acknowledge the fact that oftentimes companies might change or obscure information that prevents them from looking bad within the public eye. An example of this would be like ExxonMobil. For years, ExxonMobil knew about their impacts on climate change, but they didn't want that information going public because they didn't want to look bad within the public view.
Profits are what keep a business going and allow it to thrive. They generate the funds needed for more job creation. You don't need an advanced economics degree to understand this. So why are these CEOs so anxious to embrace this in-name-only capitalism?
So I think it's funny that Nikki Haley here says that it's quote-unquote in-name-only capitalism, which implies that it's obviously not capitalism. But then earlier she said that stakeholder capitalism was fundamentally no different than ordinary capitalism, because ordinary capitalism also works by appeasing, workers, consumers, and whatnot. It's just very odd how, Nikki Haley just doesn't see the contradiction here.
Probably because they think they need to placate the noisemakers on the socialist left. But that's a fool's game. The left is never satisfied. So let's defend what works. And what works is capitalism.